This talk is designed to talk about the revival of Buddhism in modern contemporary China, post-Mao China in particular. So there's a relatively strong political component to this talk. So those of you interested in Buddhism, you might find it tiring to talk about these political issues, but when it comes to this revival of religion and Buddhism in particular in contemporary China, it's contextualized within a very particular history, and so a good portion of the talk will be trying to sort that out so that we can appreciate religion in contemporary China, because it's often misunderstood just what the status of religion is in communist China. So that will be one of the goals of the talk, is to clarify that a bit. Let's start with, again, I don't know your background, so a real brief history of Buddhism, just so that we know what we're talking about reviving in China. So I'm guessing, based on the show of hands, most of you have a general understanding that Buddhism has its origins in India about 2,500 years ago. The historical Buddha was born in what is present-day Nepal, but lived and taught within northern India. And this slide depicts basically the spread of Buddhism throughout Asia. You may know that Buddhism is considered a missionary religion. So its adherents have made attempts to spread the teaching. It has been spread through peaceful means, through the spread of its literature, and this gives us an outline of the spread of Buddhism to Sri Lanka after the reign of Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE. From Sri Lanka, it goes to other parts of Southeast Asia. And then in the 1st century of the Common Era, it goes to China. And by the Tang Dynasty in China, from the 7th to the 10th centuries of the Common Era, it becomes thoroughly established within China and a thoroughly established part of Chinese culture. Now, to say that Buddhism becomes an established part of Chinese culture is not to say that there were no conflicts. There were always individuals within China, in particular members of the Confucian elite, as well as some Taoists, who were opposed to this foreign tradition of Buddhism, which had been imported into China. This anti-Buddhist opinion reaches a kind of pinnacle in the 9th century, when it was suppressed towards the end of the Tang Dynasty under the Wuzong Emperor. And so the 845 date there is the end of that period of suppression. And this was a period when Buddhist texts were lost, temples were destroyed, and so this was quite a devastating period of suppression of Buddhism back in the 9th century in China. And I think it is in a sense, it gives us a historical sense that Buddhism has always had to endure periods of support as well as periods of suppression. And we'll see that that is just what happens in the modern period. During the Tang Dynasty, there were Confucian intellectuals who issued these proclamations and memorials to the throne, asking the emperor to suppress Buddhism because it was polluting China and Chinese culture. There were several layers to the critique, but one of the general aspects was that the Buddhist tradition called for individuals to renounce their families and enter the monastery. But in Chinese culture, filial piety was one of the paramount values, and so leaving one's obligations to the family behind was considered the height of anti-filial behavior. And so Buddhists had to argue that this was actually a very meritorious act that could be used to benefit their parents, and that argument more or less wins the day. Nevertheless, you had these agitations to suppress this foreign corrupting tradition from India. At this time, there was actually a Taoist figure who was agitating for the destruction of Buddhism. And so the emperor was under the influence of several strains of argument. But you might, really what I haven't mentioned is that the Buddhist monasteries as establishments had acquired large amounts of wealth. And so that attracted the attention of critics. And so that's the same in the modern period as well. So when people think about Buddhism in contemporary China, they have a sense that religion has been under fire in communist China. But what I want to point out is that the campaigns against religion go back to the end of the 19th century, when a memorial by a modernist reformer was made to the emperor to destroy temples and use their property and wealth to establish schools. During this period, modernist reformers began to target religion as something that was holding back progress. And so there were campaigns throughout the early 20th century to destroy superstition and to convert temples and confiscate their wealth and build schools to educate a modern, scientifically informed public rather than one that was under the influence of religion. So this was a modernist idea in the late 19th, early 20th century. Now, you might be wondering what was the response of Buddhists to this during the early 20th century. Well, they didn't sit back and take it. There were several very energetic Buddhist monks who rose to the task to defend Chinese Buddhism against these reformers. This is when we have the first establishment of a nationalist organization for Buddhists in China to protect their rights. And they began publishing operations to publish and distribute Buddhist literature. They began to establish schools, Buddhist seminaries to raise the level of education. They also expanded the Buddhist involvement in charities. In other words, to prove that they were useful in a modern context as well. They could serve the purposes of education. They could supply public services and have a place in 20th century China. So it is sometimes spoken of as a Buddhist revival in the early 20th century China. This, however, is short-lived. So China has had a very rough 20th century, as I think many of you are probably aware. So in the 1930s, there was war with Japan. And then in the 1940s, civil war between the nationalists and the communists. So during this period, religion had no chance to revive or thrive. In 1949, civil war ends with the establishment of the People's Republic of China. And so I've broken down here the religion policy into three periods. So the first period is called restrictive. And so temples weren't going to be built, monks were not going to be ordained in large numbers, but religion was also not to be eradicated. There were to be important national monasteries that were part of Chinese culture. Money was actually given from the state to refurbish and restore some of these temples as exemplars of national Chinese culture. So this happened in the 1950s. So it was restrictive, yet it wasn't as severe as things would get in the 60s and 70s. And you might notice from the image in the lower right-hand side, the cult that develops around Chairman Mao. And this reaches a peak at the end of his life in the Cultural Revolution. We have the full name here to remind us of its roots within a communist framework, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. It was during this period that the organizations which had been set up to oversee religion were disbanded, publications regarding religion were terminated, temples were seized, they were converted to military barracks, factories, or they were destroyed. So the losses during the Cultural Revolution are incalculable to the artistic treasures, the sculptures, the architecture, this is what ended in 1976. So what was the Cultural Revolution about? Well, one of the slogans was to destroy the four olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. And the idea is that these feudalistic ideas and customs are holding people back from socialist progress. And so to progress socialist ideas, the idea was to make a complete break with this feudal, superstitious, backward past by destroying the remnants of that culture. That movement ended with the death of Mao in 1976 and the arrest of the Gang of Four. And then, under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, Kaifang, or Reform and Opening, begins in 1978 as China's official policy. So how many people have heard the phrase glasnost? Just about everyone. Perestroika? Just about everyone. How many have heard Kaifang? The Chinese. I think we will all come to see that this Kaifang is, in the end, as important, if not more important, than glasnost and perestroika. And it began a couple of years before Gorbachev's opening and reform in 1978. And how China proceeded was very carefully by opening 4 cities along the southeast coast to trade. Those cities were just across from Taiwan and Hong Kong, where you have many overseas Chinese who had not fallen to the communist and who had developed economically. And so the Chinese thought, well, let's begin with these small steps of opening for trade with these Chinese overseas just across from us in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Well, I think you know how this goes. It goes fabulously well. And now we expect China to become the world's largest economy anytime, sometime soon. All those factors every year are increasing. And so ultimately, with the success of that initial program in '78, China opens up the whole country. So what was the result for religion? What was the result for Buddhism? Well, a new policy is promulgated. It is also a policy that is more open. So there's a new constitution in 1982, which guarantees the freedom to practice religion in designated religious spaces in non-superstitious ways. I've written that as carefully as I can to get at the content of what is guaranteed. So what is guaranteed as freedom is a bit different than what we think of as freedom of religion, but I think we should do our best to try and understand what is meant by freedom of religion in China. Another document that's very important is the document 19, which is titled The Basic Viewpoint and Policy on Religious Affairs During the Socialist Period of Our Country. And again, the word socialist there is important because officially China is still being governed by the Communist Party, and officially they maintain socialism as their goal. And so their view, the socialist view of religion, is that it's poisonous to progress and freedom and liberation. And so the official view is that religion will eventually wither. This is a European Enlightenment view of religion as well. As people become more educated and more prosperous and so forth, religious faith will wither. So that's still the official policy. But they believe people are not yet ready for this to happen, and so they're tolerating religion for the foreseeable future. At the same time, members of the Communist Party are asked not to be members of a religious congregation or believers in a religion. But the other people are allowed to return to their religious beliefs because they're not yet prepared to abandon them. That's the official policy. So this tolerant policy has made space for 5 official religious traditions. And here they are: Buddhist, Taoist, Catholic, Protestant, and Islam. And the system is that there are official bureaus which oversee each of those. And so those bureaus are responsible for registering venues, registering all the clergy, and ensuring that their operations are not superstitious and in line with the goals of the country. Discussions about the suppression of Falun Gong are usually that, well, China is against religion, doesn't allow religious freedom, and so they've attacked Falun Gong. Well, the reasons are more along the lines of what you've described. It didn't fit within these 5 official organizations. It petitioned to have the Buddhists recognize them as falling under the Buddhist umbrella, but what they're doing is quite unusual from a Buddhist, a kind of orthodox Buddhist point of view. So the Buddhists didn't want to have anything to do with Falun Gong. They tried to register with health agencies as a form of physical health, but that only worked for a short period. They really grew to a very, very large number of members. And so that was itself a bit threatening. But the worst thing they did was surround the headquarters of the Communist Party in Beijing, because they wanted to be recognized as an official group. And that was the last straw, and that's what led to their suppression, which has been quite thorough in mainland China. So to get a bit closer on what is allowed and what isn't, these are the activities which are not allowed. And you can see it's quite broad. Feudal superstitions. Okay, what would count as a feudal superstition? One example would be fortune telling. And so that is an ancient Chinese tradition. You can still find this in China, but it's one of those activities that can be targeted and is targeted from time to time for suppression. Those people are asked to leave. But more and more of these folk traditions are coming back And again, there's a certain amount of leeway to interpret this, and this will differ from province to province and county to county. Some administrators of a province or county are quite open to religion, and in those places you will see more things happening. If they're not, nothing will happen. Where these really become more obvious obstacles is in the Christian traditions, for example, where missionary activity is prohibited, the distribution of Bibles is prohibited. All of these sorts of typical activities are illegal. And so this is why people who look at China from a point of view of, well, what's the status of Christians, find that it's very oppressive. And that's a whole other topic, really, for us to consider, given that we're looking at Buddhism, which is a Chinese tradition. It's in a much different situation. Well, you saw the list of 5 official religions, so it's not considered a religion. However, it has been revived over the past decade or so for its as a social ethic that is quite valuable for Chinese society. So this has been something that the Chinese are tiptoeing with rather carefully, because in the early days of the Communist Party, Confucius was public enemy number 1. His home temple was destroyed, his graves were desecrated. Confucius was blacklisted as one of the strongest forces holding China back. But in the 21st century, he's been revived. As you may know, China has been opening Confucius institutes all over the world, spreading Chinese culture and language. So Confucius has been revived. So the means of control I've listed here, just to give a sense of how this plays out. As far as the regulation of venues goes, an interesting phenomenon is unregistered religious sites, which there are hundreds of thousands of them probably at this point in China. They occupy a gray zone. And so far, China's been quite tolerant in general of these unregistered religious sites, but that's something to watch. Registration and monitoring of clergy. This is something that the Chinese state has done since the Tang Dynasty, the registration and monitoring of the clergy. So that's not a particularly new thing. The restriction of activities, we've seen that. Publications, we've seen that. So they must be approved by those bureaus which oversee the different religions. And distribution is restricted. And one of the most sensitive items on this list is the foreign contact. That's one of the most sensitive items. China believes that part of the problem of the collapse of the Soviet Union was the influence of Christian missionaries. And they want to avoid any trouble like that in mainland China. Any foreign influence. Because they suspect that it could be directed at undermining the state. So foreign influence is one of the biggies. That's the official policy. So like I say, enforcement varies from one region to China, from one region to the next. Some regions it's quite liberal, but throughout China, that's a big part of it. There's also historical reasons, but one of the things, my own research is in the south, so I'm more familiar with what's going on down there. And one of the things you'll hear down there is Tian Gao Huangdi Yuan. So heaven is high and the emperor is very far away. So we can pretty much get away with whatever we want to do. Nobody's watching. Now, over the past couple of years, this has changed. There's a high-speed rail that links Beijing to the south. That's one of the big issues for China is reunification with Taiwan. One thing I'll say about Buddhism is that Taiwan has been an important source for a certain amount of Buddhist knowledge, information, know-how in the revival of Buddhism in China, because monks fled to Taiwan with their knowledge, especially some of the eminent monks. They established congregations in Taiwan that are some of the leading Buddhist congregations in the world today in Taiwan. They have quite effective organizations, Buddhist organizations in Taiwan. And so those serve now as models for the more ambitious temples that will be developing in mainland China. Part of the story is investors from Taiwan wanting to invest in China wanted to visit their ancestral temples, wanted to visit the temples and monasteries in their home provinces, hometowns. And so as part of their investing in China, they also invested in the rebuilding of temples. And so the rebuilding that, as I've said in the previous slide, is ubiquitous, has been in its early stages funded by overseas Chinese in Taiwan and other parts of in Southeast Asia, Singapore, Philippines. I just got back from Philadelphia, the Association of Asian Studies Conference, where I gave a talk on the role of transnational networks in the revival of Buddhism in post-Mao China. That was looking specifically at southern China and its links to Southeast Asia. And in the early days, it was a source of the bulk of the funding for the revival. That's all changed. They have all the money they need locally now. And so they can fund their own building projects. But it's been a very interesting trajectory to follow from the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s, from poverty to wealth for so many of these areas and temples. So this was a photo taken in southern China of monks processing to bring Buddha images to a newly founded temple. So this is happening every day in China. Typically, the project will be headed up by a monk who may have a position, a high position typically at another monastery, but they have their own disciples and they have their own networks, so they collect funds to establish, to buy or repurchase or acquire this land and build or rebuild the temple. So the leadership is usually the person who's behind the project. But there aren't enough monks to lead all of these temples. So what's happening, of course, is one monk is now the head of half a dozen or a dozen temples in these parts of southern China where there's so many temples being rebuilt. So the roles played by monasteries are quite multiple, and this contributes to the multiple aspects of a Buddhist temple in contemporary China. And with the remaining time, I'll try to describe the different types of Buddhist monasteries that we can find in China. So the most traditional aspect of a monastery is that it is a site for the training of Buddhist monastics. It is also a site for lay Buddhists to acquire merit by supporting the monastery. They have become and have been, for as long as we know, sites of important cultural heritage, sites of historic value, and very often sites of natural beauty. So these other properties of monasteries are valued by the state, by people whose main goal is economic development rather than the revival of religion. So we have different forces that are actually interested in the revival of these monasteries. Some for tourist development, some for the revival of religion. So after the Cultural Revolution, we had many older monks who had returned to lay life. During the Cultural Revolution, well, they returned to the monastery in the 1980s and 90s. So one of the traditional roles of a monastery is as a place to go and get away from the dust of the world. That's a function they've been serving in China for hundreds of years. That's a function they still serve. This would be an example. This temple outside of Beijing, people go for the weekend to get away from the hustle and bustle and pollution of Beijing. Although I think there's a danger of that pollution seeping up into these mountains. But for the time being, it is a refuge. That's one of the roles that they play. This one is in the south on an island called Xiamen. And it's a very important temple. It's the home of an important Buddhist seminary that trains a great percentage of the Buddhist elites today. They're trained at the Minan Foshueyuan, which is down here in Namputuo Monastery. This is a popular tourist site. It's in Xi'an. Xi'an, outside of Xi'an, is where you'll find Bing Ma Yong, the terracotta soldiers. That you have some examples, or I guess replicas, down here at the Chinese Cultural Center. But this is a famous temple, Buddhist monastery, associated with the Tang Dynasty monk Xuanzang, who was a great pilgrim. He went to India. He taught at the Buddhist University in India and brought scriptures back. And those scriptures were put in this pagoda called the Wild Goose Pagoda. Well, it's now a major tourist attraction. So this is another important function. Apart from the revival of religion and those traditional values, we have these tourist sites. So if you were to go to China, and some of you may have been to China, you would most have likely visited temples which serve as tourist sites. And that's one of the directions temples are pulled in, to be a tourist site. And of course, the other traditional role is to be a place of Buddhist cultivation. So we'll first look at some of the aspects of the tourist temple. You'll find ticket windows, turnstiles, tour buses. This one is in Beijing. They call it the Lama Temple sometimes, Yonghe Gong. It's a very popular site. Other temples have been converted into museums, so there's no functioning Buddhist community here. The grounds are maintained as a culture museum. And the signs are in multiple languages, and they educate visitors about Buddhist history and culture. It's a particular function. It's not the traditional, or at least not the most traditional function of a monastery. And if you go to that particular Buddhist temple, you will be greeted by a 3D Buddha head who will talk to you in Chinese. So this is a cloud dwelling temple outside of Beijing. It is largely a tourist site. There were a couple of monks living here, but they said that the temple was largely controlled by a third party, a temple management company. So instead of these Dharma instruments being used in ritual purposes, they're here in a display case. So this is one aspect that you will see in China today. So the cultural heritage aspect is also important, although tragically so much of this has been lost. So it's quite thrilling when you find these sites where some of it was preserved, such as this particular temple, which has this 16th century guanyin, which is quite lovely. That's at the back of one of the halls. A Qianlong stele from the Qing dynasty. And there are entirely new sites that are developed. These are of a different nature. These are part private business investments. So this is a place that was built in part to serve as the site of a World Buddhist Forum in 2008, or 2009 actually. And so it's a huge Buddha statue. In the middle of the complex is a small temple, but this one is really like a Buddhist Disneyland. And the ticket, the entry ticket, is quite expensive. The other side, so if many visitors to China, that's what they see. And they leave with this impression that communist China doesn't have real religion. It just has these tourist sites. Well, if you dig further, you will find very authentic, revived Buddhist temples. This happens more easily at places that are not as famous, or places which don't have much to offer tourists. But more importantly is they require leadership by a talented monastic. And I will show some sites that have a mixed identity, that are both tourist sites and places of practice. So this is an example of a revived temple led by talented members of the Buddhist Sangha. This is Bailin Chan Monastery. It's about 186 miles south of Beijing. It was destroyed. Everything but the pagoda was destroyed. It was revived under the efforts of a monk called Jinghui. This began in 1988. And 10 years later, they had built this 10,000 Buddha hall, which is pictured here. There are literally 10,000 Buddha images throughout the hall. There's a 10,000 Buddha hall underway here in Calgary, in downtown Calgary at the Avatamsaka Monastery. So this was the 4 a.m. morning service, which is the standard morning service that one will find at functioning Buddhist monasteries. So they wake up and go to the main hall. And then after that is breakfast. And this is the abbot overseeing breakfast in the dining hall. He is a graduate of Beijing University. He had some role in the 1989 democracy protests. And like many of those people who became disenfranchised in various ways, he turned to Buddhism. And now he's the leader of this thriving monastery. One of its main activities is a summer camp, which has about 500 participants every year, and they practice Zen meditation and learn some basic teachings of Buddhism. There's also a publication associated with this monastery. Another monastery that I've been told about as one of the more respectable monasteries to find genuine Buddhist monastic practice is this Taimu Pingxing Si in Fujian. There are many smaller temples, and these are not tourist sites. And they go about their daily services and particular kinds of practices. The non-registered ones are not really doing anything that different. It may just be the case that they haven't gone through whatever bureaucratic red tape is required to become registered. When it comes to the Protestant and Christian religions, the unregistered ones are doing something different. They may have a bishop who's recognized by the Pope, as opposed to the patriotic Catholic registered churches, which that's illegal. They don't want papal interference, so China names its own popes. So there are big differences between the different Christian groups. But with the Buddhist, Han Buddhist, it's not as dramatic. Tibetan Buddhism, that's a whole other story. So this is an example of a monastery where practice has become revived in quite a vibrant way. Large groups, more than 2,000, gather here once a month to eat bowls of noodles, offer incense, and make other kinds of offerings and monetary offerings as well. Ritual practices have been revived. So this, again, a question was asked about what is considered superstitious. Well, most of the orthodox kinds of practices of the official religions are okay. So this is what's called a release of life ceremony. There are small cages that you might be able to see on the floor, and there are birds in those small cages that have been purchased. The birds were to be used as food, and so a Buddhist practice is to buy such animals and release them in order to gain that merit from saving them from death, which is the first precept in Buddhism, to not take life. The Buddhist tradition has traditionally ranked male monks above the female monastics. And the idea has been that the lowest ranking male monastic is higher or above any ranking female monastic. So that is what is recognized as a patriarchal aspect to Buddhism that has been there traditionally. Nowadays, that's being challenged. And there is, again, with the high numbers of female monastics, I'm calling them that rather than nuns because, well, it's probably more accurate to try and distinguish them from the Catholic tradition. We all very often borrow terms, and sometimes it obscures more than it reveals. But your question, about the status of clergy. Well, there isn't quite the same idea of having a priest who can administer certain rituals that others cannot. Buddhism doesn't have quite as strong a identity for its clergy. Monks do have different roles and leadership positions, and women can ascend to to parallel leadership roles within the convents, if we choose to call them that. This is inside the main hall of this temple, where some 200 lay Buddhists, most of them older women, gather to chant the Buddha's name. And they do this inside the hall, and then they exit the hall and walk around the temple while chanting Amitabha Buddha's name. And they're joined by other members of the community there. And this large event happens once a month. A smaller event where they gather in the main hall like this happens twice a week. In addition to those aspects of Buddhist practice, ritual practice, devotional practice, other aspects that we haven't seen, there is this tourist aspect that you find at that site, because there are very important cultural properties, such as these pagodas, which are made out of granite. They're more than 800 years old. They have sculptures all around them of Buddhist figures. And so they're quite important treasures that have survived. And so it is inevitably a tourist site. Well, they have a long history in the Buddhist tradition, and it goes back to the death of the historical Buddha. And after his death, the Buddhist community was quite distraught, and they wanted to hang on to the body of the Buddha, represented by the relics that were left after his cremation. So those relics were divided, and funerary monuments were built over those relics. And so this established a tradition of worshiping the Buddha at these stupas, as they call them. In China, they're pagodas. So they look differently. They evolve as they move from India to China. And so depending on where you are in the Buddhist world, the pagodas will look quite different. These turn out to be quite unique, period, actually, these pagodas. They're not at all typical either in China, which is another reason that they're quite valued. All right, so this was part of the presentation I gave in Philadelphia a couple of days ago. This is that other aspect of the revival of Buddhism, relying on funding from overseas Chinese in Singapore, in Malaysia, and the Philippines. So this was a network that was established in the early 20th century when traditional sources of funding were lost. Buddhist monks from that red dot in Fujian in southeast China, they took to the seas and traveled to all these places. They established temples. These became the most important Chinese Buddhist monasteries throughout Southeast Asia. And of course, in Singapore, they were well supported and able to send quite a bit of money back to China to help with the rebuilding effort after the death of Mao. So that's another very interesting part of the story. So I will stop there with the large Buddha and say that religion, has returned to China, and believers are able to pursue their own faith within the limits that have been set forth. There is a space for the restoration of religion. Just how that space will broaden, only time will tell.